back up a step because I missed something that we don't always end up talking about, because I think most of what I do for retail gets highlighted. A lot of what I do is real estate. My first business was real estate. My first business was investing, buying single family homes, understanding that business, which helped me. I leveraged that skill set into retail. So on outside of the Whitaker Group, also own companies that provide housing for less fortunate people. If that makes sense. I've been doing that probably a little longer than I've been doing retail, but that's an important step because that's where it started, right? Like going back to Pittsburgh, coming up from the very beginning, grew up in Pittsburgh, really impoverished neighborhood, projects as we all know it. So I grew up in the projects. All of my family grew up in the projects. So coming up through that journey, it was like how, like the thing wrapped in my mind was like, okay, how do I just get out of here and make a living? And get out and make a living. Like as a kid, right? That was the first thing. As I start growing as an adult, you start realizing that, you know, the power of choices, positive and negative choices. And you start to also understanding the importance of learning through listening and learning through failing, right? Which is two different kinds of things, right? Like, and I think for a kid that's 13 and 14 years old, there's a difference, right? Because there's certain things that I would now, as a 41-year-old, never suggest a 14-year-old try. If you can avoid selling drugs, avoid it. If you can avoid the traps of gangs, you avoid them. If you can avoid some of those things, by all means necessary, avoid them. Because if you don't avoid them, some of the things that I had to experience, being shot, going to prison, watching most of my friends get killed, those are things that I needed to experience, not needed, that I experienced to make me understand the importance of not continuing down that path. As we pivot, once I realized in my late teens, early 20s, after serving time in federal prison and realizing like, okay, I understand the spectrum of choices now, right? There's you can look cool if you're a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, you're struggling in adolescence because you want to look cool and you want to try to connect to cool kids. But I think the things that I try to tell my kids most is you have to create your own version of what's cool. And that may not look cool to everyone at the time. Just like when you're starting a business, at that time, if that business in most cases isn't making money. So you're not going to look like a huge success to all of your friends. No different than when you're on a court, right? When everybody had to first learn to dribble with their left hand, that first day it was tough. It felt extremely awkward, right? But eventually you get the left hand down, then eventually you're shooting with your left hand, then eventually you could cross off a down with your left hand. But in the beginning, when you were out there by yourself trying to dribble with your left hand, you were vulnerable, people were watching, it was hard to figure out, it was uncomfortable. Life is the same way. The right things to do don't always look like the coolest things to do in the beginning, if that makes sense. And that's one of the things that I had to learn very early. Like, okay, not moving against the crowd doesn't make you not cool. It actually makes you a leader. Having the strength to go against the grain and understanding that going against the grain for the right reasons is going to lead you to a more positive space. That's true leadership. So I said all that to get into the first step. My first step was coming home from federal prison and realizing that two things was going to happen. Either I was going back to federal prison for a long time, or I was never going back to federal prison. I knew it was going to be one extreme or the other, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I knew that the path of least resistance was real estate. From Pittsburgh, you can get properties at the time for 8, 9, 10 grand. So I took the money I had saved and threw it into a rental property. And that kind of got everything jump started at that point. Like investing money into a rental property, figuring out, hey, you put eight grand in this rental property. I got in there and learned how to do drywall, got in there and learned how to do electric, got in there and learned how to do a lot of different things. I walk out and that same property that I paid $9,000 for and $15,000 in equity go into the project now is worth $81,000, $82,000. It starts to change. Like, okay, I got something here. Maybe I need to keep down this path, because if I keep down this path, it can get me out of and keep me away from the streets. I'll stop there for a second because I said a lot.